At my own son's wedding dinner. He wiped me from existence with a handful of words in front of everyone who mattered to us. That evening remains burned into my memory, every detail sharp as broken glass as he called me his cleaner simply because I had a neck tumor. I'll tell you everything, but first let me thank you for watching Granny's Voice. Please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Share your story in the comments. I want to know how many of you have walked through betrayal like this. Today's special shout-out goes to Tina from South Africa. Thank you for being part of our family. Now let me tell you everything. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the reception hall. Guests' laughter mingled with the band's melody. And there I sat, quietly at my designated table, hands clasped, heart bursting with maternal pride. I had invested everything in this celebration. Over $150,000 from my life savings. This wasn't merely money. It represented decades of work, countless sacrifices, and a mother's unwavering love for her only child. I believed I was giving him the perfect start to his new life. As David stood to address the crowd, I prepared myself for the moment I'd dreamed of. There was my son, handsome in his black tuxedo, confident as he gripped the microphone. Despite being shut out of most wedding decisions, I convinced myself this would be my vindication, the instant he would publicly acknowledge his real mother. I sat straighter, the surgical scar on my throat pulling tight as I lifted my chin. But his words weren't meant for me. "I want to thank Alice," he announced, turning toward the younger woman beside my ex-husband. "She's been like a mother to me. Actually, she is my mother. She's the reason I'm standing here today as the man I've become." Applause erupted. Glasses chimed together. Alice pressed her perfectly manicured hand to her chest, dabbing at crocodile tears. Then, almost carelessly, David gestured in my direction. "And of course there's Marcia. She's helped tremendously around the house. Always there, keeping everything organized. She's like family. Really like the housekeeper who keeps everything running smoothly." Scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd. Those words sliced deeper than any blade. My son, whom I had carried, nursed, clothed, fed, and sacrificed everything for, had reduced me to hired help in front of his bride, her family, his friends, and my smirking ex-husband. I sat frozen, unable to move or breathe properly. Scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd. Those words sliced deeper than any blade. My son, whom I had carried, nursed, clothed, fed, and sacrificed everything for, had reduced me to hired help in front of his bride, her family, his friends, and my smirking ex-husband. I sat frozen, unable to move or breathe properly. Every eye in that room seemed to slide over me, some with confusion, others with pity, many simply brushing past without thought. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I forced my spine straight, curved my lips into the faintest smile, and swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. Inside, however, I was crumbling. The remainder of his speech dissolved into meaningless noise. Toasts were raised, laughter filled the space, but I heard nothing. Only his betrayal echoed in my ears. He had rewritten my identity, my own son, erasing my motherhood as if my sacrifices were invisible. So I did the only thing I could to salvage what remained of my dignity. I stood quietly, smoothed my dress, and walked out. No scene, no confrontation, no desperate plea for recognition. I simply walked into the cool night air, leaving behind the music and clinking glasses, letting silence embrace me. But as my heels clicked across the parking lot pavement, a storm was building inside me. He thought he had silenced me, buried me beneath shame and humiliation. What he didn't realize, what none of them knew, was that I still possessed the power to tear down every false foundation he had built his life upon. That night, as tears stung my eyes but resolve strengthened my spine, I made a silent vow. If he could deny me as his mother, then I would show him exactly who I was in ways he'd never forget. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that night my fingers ached. The banquet hall lights disappeared in my rearview mirror, replaced by the endless dark highway stretching ahead. My dress still carried traces of perfume and champagne, But all I felt was humiliation clinging to me like smoke. My son's words replayed endlessly. "She's like the housekeeper who keeps everything running." That's how he described me after 62 years of building my life around him, after emptying my bank account to give him a wedding he didn't deserve. The car's silence was suffocating. I didn't even turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. My mind replayed memories like an old film reel, each frame sharper than the last. The years spent cleaning other people's homes when Marcus was small, ensuring he had shoes without holes. Late nights helping with homework after working double shifts. The sacrifices to send him to law school, convincing myself it would all be worthwhile when I saw him succeed. And then the final blow, the wedding. I had written every check without complaint, from flowers to band, believing this was my gift of love. $150,000. That number haunted me like a curse. I had traded my security, my retirement, the cushion I had worked a lifetime to build, for a moment I believed would unite our family. In return I had been erased. Tears slid down my cheeks. Not soft tears of grief, but hot, angry, bitter tears. I thought about every dollar I had signed away, how each purchase had bought my own humiliation. Then something shifted inside me. That money wasn't gone or wasted. It was a receipt, documentation of how much I had given. And that receipt would become my evidence when I decided to collect what was truly mine. As the car cut through darkness, I noticed how peaceful the streets were. Families slept in their homes, warm light glowing in windows. I thought about all the mothers tucked in their beds, probably dreaming proudly of their children. Meanwhile I drove alone, scarred, humiliated, cast aside. Loneliness pressed down on me, but beneath it burned something stronger. Resolve. If Marcus had announced to the world that I was nothing more than his maid, then he had given me permission to stop carrying him as a son. I parked in front of my house, the same house where I had raised him, the same house I had fought tooth and nail to keep after Robert abandoned us. I sat in the driveway for a long time before cutting the engine, listening to the car's cooling ticks fill the silence. I knew then that silence would be my weapon. I wouldn't shout, beg for acknowledgement, or demand respect. I would let my actions speak, slowly, carefully, in ways that would strip him of everything he thought he owned. That drive home was the longest of my life, but it was also the beginning of something I had never imagined for myself. Revenge. I often remind myself that people see the glory but never know the story. They saw my son standing tall at that wedding, appearing self-made. But if they had witnessed the early years, the real years, they would know he was standing on the back of a mother who had carried the weight alone. When Marcus was little, our life was constant struggle. His father Robert was perpetually inconsistent, some weeks playing husband and father, the next vanishing to chase business schemes or women who made him feel young again. I never knew if rent would be paid on time or if I'd be juggling late notices and eviction threats. More often than not, it was just me at the kitchen table late into the night, bills spread before me, half-empty coffee growing cold as I tried to stretch numbers beyond their limits. I worked wherever I could find hours. By day, I held steady office work, answering phones and filing papers for men who looked straight through me as if I were invisible. By night, I scrubbed floors in other people's homes, polished their furniture, washed their linens, and left before sunrise so they'd never see the woman who quietly kept their lives neat and shining. I'd slip in while they were gone, clean their messes, and slip out like I had never existed. Then I'd hurry home to pack lunches, braid Marcus's hair when he was small, and walk him to school with a smile that hid my exhaustion. There were days when my body felt like it couldn't continue. I remember one night coming home from cleaning an office building, hands raw from bleach water, finding Marcus asleep at the kitchen table. He had waited up for me with homework spread out. I sat beside him, gently shook him awake, and helped finish his math problems, even though my eyes could barely focus. He hugged me that night and said, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." I carried that sentence in my heart for years like a medal, before the world taught him to be ashamed of me. It wasn't glamorous. No vacations, no designer clothes, no nights out. Every dollar went to survival. Food on the table, gas in the car, books for school. When Robert drifted back in, it was never to help shoulder the load but to criticize me for not keeping myself up, for looking tired, for not being enough of the woman he thought he deserved. Yet despite his absence and constant instability, I ensured Marcus never went without. He might not have had the latest gadgets, but he had clean clothes, daily meals, and a mother who would have laid down her life for him without hesitation. Looking back, I realize those years forged me into steel. Sacrifice became my second language, dignity my shield. I never let my son see how deeply I was breaking inside. He saw a mother who could handle anything, even if it meant swallowing her pride. What I didn't know then was that every sacrifice was also planting a seed. Seeds that would later bloom into bitterness when he grew up and forgot the cost of his success. But seeds don't die just because people pretend not to notice them. They grow silently underground until one day they break through with force. As I reflect on those early years, I see clearly now that my sacrifices weren't just the story of how I raised my son. They were the story of how I was preparing myself for the day I would reclaim everything he tried to take from me. Life has a way of knocking you down precisely when you think you've found your footing. For me, it was the day the doctor leaned across his desk and said the word tumor. Thyroid, he explained. They would need to test, cut, monitor. I sat frozen, hands clenched in my lap, as if holding still enough might prevent the word from sticking. But it did, like glue to my mind's walls. The following months blurred with hospital visits, medication, and cold machine touches. Treatments were exhausting. My body weakened, energy drained, and the scar that would forever mark my neck began forming. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the mirror reflecting a woman I barely recognized each morning. Neck swelling made me self-conscious, and I found myself pulling scarves high, hiding from my own reflection as much as the outside world. But the hardest blow didn't come from the diagnosis. It came from the man who had promised to stand beside me through sickness and health. Robert grew distant. At first, it was subtle. Shorter hospital visits, hurried phone calls. Then it became glaring. Excuses to stay late at work, dinner table silence, unexplained weekend absences. The more fragile I became, the stronger his distance grew. Then one night, without argument or goodbye, he simply didn't come home. His things were gone. I had always known Robert's love was shallow, but nothing prepared me for the cruelty of abandonment when I needed him most. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel. I was battling for my health while suddenly fighting for survival, emotionally, financially, and as a mother. Marcus was a teenager then, old enough to understand but too young to grasp the wound's depth. Robert began parading Victoria into his life, young, vibrant, unscarred. She became a presence at events, a cheerful distraction from the mother who was tired, swollen, and marked by illness. Slowly, without realizing it, Marcus's loyalties began shifting. He liked her easy smile, polished words, her way of making him feel he was stepping into a brighter, shinier world. And I, still recovering, could feel my son slipping further from my arms. Financial strain was relentless. Medical bills piled high, each envelope reminding me that sickness carried a price tag I could hardly afford. With Robert gone, every responsibility fell back on me. Even when my body cried out for rest, I dragged myself to work, covering shifts I had no strength for, scrubbing floors with trembling hands because rent and utilities didn't pause for cancer scares or broken marriages. Every scar, the visible one on my neck and the invisible ones in my heart, was earned during those nights when I fought to hold everything together alone. But what hurt most wasn't the bills or even Robert's desertion. It was watching Marcus look at me with growing shame, as though my illness had made me less. He didn't say it then, but I saw it in his eyes. Where once he had told me I was the strongest woman he knew, now he looked at me as though I were fragile, embarrassing, something to hide. I told myself it was just teenage discomfort that he would outgrow. But deep down, I knew the fracture had begun. Standing at my mirror one night, staring at the angry scar across my throat, I whispered a truth I had never spoken aloud. They left me when I needed them most. But I am still here. That whisper became my anchor. They could take their distance, their polished images, their shallow love, but they couldn't take the fact that I was a survivor. When Robert left, he didn't leave me to heal in peace. He filled the void with someone new, someone younger, someone unscarred. Her name was Victoria. The first time I saw her was at a school event for Marcus. She walked in on Robert's arm with unmistakable confidence. Head high, clothes pristine, every step calculated to be noticed. And noticed she was. Even Marcus's friends looked at her with curiosity, some whispering about how stylish she seemed. I sat a few rows back, scarf pulled tight around my neck, trying to disappear into my seat. Victoria was everything Robert thought I wasn't anymore. She was polished where I was tired, glamorous where I was plain, healthy where I was healing. She wasted no time slipping into the cracks my illness and Robert's betrayal had left behind. She didn't scold Marcus when his grades slipped, she flattered him. She didn't lecture about responsibilities. She laughed and made him feel important. Slowly, I watched as she positioned herself not just as Robert's companion, but as a new kind of mother in my son's eyes. Marcus was drawn to her. At first, it was small things. How she remembered his favorite snacks, how she bought him gifts just because. Then it became more serious. She started helping with things I had always managed. School applications, birthday parties, even simple advice he once sought from me. I could feel him slipping away with every passing month. It wasn't that he stopped loving me entirely, but he began seeing me differently. Where Victoria sparkled with youth and confidence, I was the reminder of struggle and scars. I knew it in how he hesitated to invite friends to my small, tidy house but bragged about weekends at his father's with Victoria. I saw it in how he rushed to tell me stories about things Victoria had said or done, as if seeking my approval, as though her opinion carried more weight than mine. Slowly, he began looking embarrassed when I appeared in my work uniform or wore scarves that hid my neck's swelling. It was as though he decided one version of mother was acceptable and another was not, and I was the one being pushed out. Victoria never had to say much to me directly. Her power lay in what she didn't say. The polite smiles, the subtle way she placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder in my presence, the faint tone of ownership when she referred to him as our boy. It was quiet theft, and I stood by powerless as she rewrote herself into his life. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that Marcus would grow older and see through the surface. That he would remember who had been there through every fever, scraped knee, every night of hunger disguised as smaller portions on my plate so he could eat more. But deep down I feared something else, that Robert and Victoria's polish, their charm, their pretense of success would permanently reshape how my son saw me, not as the backbone of his life, but as the scarred woman who cleaned other people's messes to keep him afloat. And in time I realized that was exactly what was happening. There are nights etched so vividly in my memory that I can still smell the sting of bleach and taste the bitter coffee that kept me upright. Those were the nights I carried the world on my shoulders while my son slept peacefully, never knowing how much it took to keep his dreams alive. When Marcus got accepted into law school, I cried tears of joy. Not because I doubted his ability, but because I knew the cost. Tuition, books, living expenses, all on top of bills that already seemed to grow taller each month. His father Robert made a show of pride at family gatherings, but when envelopes arrived in the mail, it was my hands that opened them, my account that paid them. I picked up extra office shifts during the day, but it was never enough. So at night, when the world slept, I changed from heels to sneakers, grabbed bucket and rags, and headed to downtown buildings where lights never went out. There I scrubbed floors until my back screamed, polished desks carelessly left sticky with coffee rings, and emptied trash bins full of papers that suited men would never consider twice. Every paycheck from those hours was spoken for before it reached my hands. Tuition first, then books, then rent. Some mornings I'd stumble home as the sun rose, too exhausted to cook breakfast but forcing myself anyway. I'd set a plate before Marcus, urging him to eat while hiding my trembling hands beneath the table. He never knew that his tuition being paid on time wasn't due to loans or scholarships, but because his mother's knees were raw from scrubbing. I made sure he never knew. I wanted him to believe his life was stable, his path paved, success within reach without my sacrifice's shadow following him. But my body kept score. The tumor in my neck was healing, but the scar remained fresh and angry. I wore scarves every season, tugging them up even in summer heat, because I couldn't stand how people's eyes lingered on it. At work, I noticed colleagues glancing too long, then politely looking away. On buses, strangers gave quick double takes. At home, my own son began avoiding direct looks at it. I could feel his discomfort. He never said a word, but silence can be louder than words. The silence of a boy ashamed of how his mother looked. Still I pressed forward. Each time I pulled out my checkbook, each time I dropped another payment envelope in the mailbox, I reminded myself this was the price of his future. My investment not in stocks or property but in a boy I believed would one day become a man who remembered who carried him here. The irony is that the very sacrifices I made became reasons he drifted away. He saw cleaning jobs as something embarrassing, the scar as something ugly, exhaustion as weakness. Where I saw proof of survival, he saw reminders of poverty and illness. That distance between what I meant and what he saw grew wider every year. But I never stopped. Even when my bones ached, even when I went home wrapping heating pads around my back just to get a few hours rest before another shift, I kept going. Because that's what mothers do. We break ourselves to build our children whole. Yet sitting here now looking back I realize something. Every check I wrote, every shift I worked, every scar I carried was more than sacrifice. It was power. Power he would one day regret underestimating. Because while he thought he was erasing me from his story, I was writing chapters he would never be able to undo. When Marcus first told me he was getting married, I felt joy so sharp it nearly cut me. I pictured myself finally watching my sacrifices bloom into something beautiful. A day when he would stand proud and I would stand beside him as his mother, honored for the role I had played in bringing him there. But almost immediately, that joy was tempered by responsibility's weight. Weddings like the one he wanted were expensive, and though I had already given him more than most mothers could ever dream of, he looked to me again. And I, as always, opened my savings, draining what little security I had left. The venue, catering, flowers, suits. One by one I wrote the checks. Each payment was a piece of my retirement, a piece of the future I had once imagined for myself. But I told myself it was worth it. This was his day, and my duty as a mother was to make it shine. The irony, of course, was that the more money I poured in, the less voice I seemed to have. I wasn't asked which song should play or which color should decorate the hall. I wasn't invited to food tastings or photographer meetings. Robert and Victoria were there for those. I would hear later about how Victoria suggested the cake flavor or how she accompanied them to pick centerpieces. Her name was threaded into every detail that should have been mine. I tried not to let it sting. I told myself it was enough to know I was funding it, that my love was written into every detail, even if my name wasn't. But small humiliations began to pile up. Too subtle to make a scene over but sharp enough to leave scars. One day when we sat down to discuss seating arrangements, I noticed my name wasn't on the head table list. I asked about it gently, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Mom, it'll just be simpler this way. We don't want to confuse the guests." I stared at him, confused them. How? I was his mother. But then he moved on quickly, talking about the order of speeches, as if my presence at the table wasn't worth a second thought. Another time, I found out that the bride's family had been told Victoria was playing a major role in the wedding planning, as though she were the one who had earned that position, not me. The message was clear, even if it wasn't spoken outright. Victoria fit the image they wanted to present while I was better off in the shadows. I kept telling myself it was nerves, that weddings were stressful, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But in my gut, I knew the stage was being set for something worse. Every receipt I filed away, every check I signed felt like a stone I was laying in the foundation of a house where I wasn't welcome. And yet I continued because I thought love and sacrifice could cover the cracks. I thought that money would translate to honor. But the truth was simmering just beneath the surface. And as the date drew closer, I could feel it pressing down on me. The sense that the same love I was pouring out would be used as the very weapon to cut me down. The room was lit like a dream. Golden chandeliers shimmering above, crystal glasses catching the light and soft music humming in the background. I sat at my table, spine straight, hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting. It was the moment every mother dreams of, the moment she is introduced not just as a guest, but as the heart behind the man standing in front of the world. I waited for my name. Marcus took the microphone with a smile so broad it nearly split his face. Sophia glowed beside him, her family beaming with pride. My chest swelled even after all the subtle humiliations that had preceded this night. I told myself this was it, the moment he would look at me, his real mother, and acknowledge everything I had done to carry him here. Instead, he turned to Victoria. "I want to thank Victoria," he began, his voice strong and sure. "She's been like a mother to me. In fact, she is my mother. She's the reason I stand here today as the man I am." Applause thundered through the hall. Glasses clinked. His words rolled over me like ice water. Victoria pressed her manicured hand to her chest and gave a dainty, tearful nod, her lips trembling just enough to seem sincere. Guests leaned in, smiling at her, whispering to one another, their eyes filled with admiration. And then, with a casual cruelty of someone brushing lint from a jacket, Marcus gestured toward me. "And of course Elena, she's helped so much with the household, always there keeping things tidy. She's like family, really like the housekeeper who kept things running." A few guests laughed softly, unsure if it was meant as a joke. Others glanced at me briefly, some with pity, others with confusion, before turning their attention back to him. I felt every gaze cut across me like a blade. Robert sat in silence, his face betraying nothing, not a word of correction, not even the smallest gesture to acknowledge me. He allowed Victoria to bask in a false crown, smiling faintly as though everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Victoria leaned into the attention, soaking in every glance and compliment that followed. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin, playing the part of the honored matriarch. She didn't need to say a word. The applause, the smiles, the way people reached to shake her hand, told me everything in that room. At that moment, she had successfully stolen what was mine. I sat frozen, hands clenched tight beneath the tablecloth. The walls of the hall seemed to close in. The music muffled, the air heavy. I had been reduced to nothing in the very space I had paid for. In the celebration I had built with my sacrifices, it was as though my motherhood had been stripped from me in front of everyone, erased with a single sentence. The crushing weight of it pressed into my chest. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake working, of the mornings I had dragged myself out of bed despite illness, of the checks I had written with trembling hands. And all of it had led to this, the public denial of who I was. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply sat in that chair, forcing a faint smile onto my lips, though inside I was crumbling. Dignity was the only shield I had left. When the applause faded, I rose quietly, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and walked out of the hall. No one followed. No one stopped me. I left them to their laughter, their music, their toasts built on lies. But as I stepped into the night air, a truth settled into me heavier than anything I had ever carried. My son had killed something inside me that night. And yet in doing so, he had awakened something else, something that would not stay silent. The air outside the banquet hall was crisp, the kind of air that should have refreshed me. But instead, it carried the sting of everything I had just endured. Behind me, laughter and music spilled faintly through the closed doors. Inside, my son was celebrating his new life while erasing mine. But I didn't rush back in. I didn't demand to be heard. I didn't beg for recognition. I walked away quietly, deliberately, each step carrying more meaning than any words could. There is a power in silence that most people don't understand. To them, silence looks like defeat. To me, that night, it became the very first act of my revenge. By refusing to fight publicly, I denied them the spectacle they expected. They wanted me to break, to cry out, to lose control so they could say, "See, this is why we didn't acknowledge her." Instead, I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked with a grace they could never take from me. I would not let them watch me crumble. As my heels tapped against the pavement, the symbolism of it all weighed on me. My son had thrown away his dignity in front of everyone by diminishing the woman who made him. But I had kept mine intact by leaving without a scene. He thought he had silenced me, but silence can roar louder than any outburst. It leaves people unsettled, wondering what storm might be building beneath the stillness. Walking away meant I took the power with me. Inside that hall they toasted lies. Outside I carried the truth, the receipts of every sacrifice, every dollar, every scar. They believed I was erased, but I knew better. I had not lost my voice. I was choosing when and how to use it. And when I did, it would not be in front of a crowd that applauded falsehoods. It would be in ways that stripped them piece by piece until there was nothing left but the truth they had tried to bury. I remember stopping briefly by my car. One hand pressed against the cool metal, steadying myself. My eyes burned with unshed tears, but my heart beat with something new. Resolve. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. My dignity wasn't lost. It was sharpened into a weapon. In that quiet exit, I set the tone for everything that would come after. They thought I was walking away from the wedding. What they didn't know was that I was walking toward their reckoning. When I got home that night, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat in the dark, shoes still on my feet, dress still clinging to me, staring into the quiet. The humiliation from the wedding clung to me like smoke. But as the hours passed, the silence gave birth to something else. Memory. My eyes drifted to the old wooden cabinet in the corner. To the bottom drawer where I had tucked away papers years ago. Papers that told a story my son had long forgotten or perhaps had never truly known. That house, the one he now lived in and boasted about to his friends, had not simply fallen into his lap. It had been fought for inch by inch, dollar by dollar, when Robert and I split apart. Divorce is never clean, and ours was brutal. Robert wanted everything, the house, the car, even accounts he had hardly contributed to. He believed walking out meant walking away with the spoils, leaving me with scraps. But I wouldn't let him. That house was more than bricks and wood. It was where I had rocked Marcus to sleep as a baby, where I had patched holes in school uniforms, where I had held us together when Robert wandered off chasing someone new. I fought tooth and nail to keep it. And I won. The memory came back sharp. Sitting across from Robert in that courtroom. His lawyer smirking as though I didn't stand a chance. My hands had trembled, but my voice had not. I laid out proof of every payment I had made, every sacrifice, every dollar that had gone into maintaining that house. And when the ruling came down, it was mine, my name on the deed, my signature on the mortgage, my home, and no one else's. In the years that followed, I worked endlessly to keep it. Bills piled high, repairs drained my pockets, but I never let it go. And when Marcus grew older, needing a place to live while building his life, I let him move in. I told myself it was what mothers did, making sure their children had a foundation, even if it meant I shouldered the burden. He lived there as if it were his own, decorating, inviting friends over, even speaking as though he had earned it. I never corrected him. I thought my silence was love. I thought letting him believe it was his would help him feel strong. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his betrayal, I saw my silence differently. I had handed him the illusion of ownership. When the truth had been folded neatly into that bottom drawer all along, the title deed, the documents with my name in bold, they were still there, untouched, waiting for the day I might need to remember who really built this life. I rose from the chair, walked to the cabinet, and pulled open the drawer. My hands brushed past old photographs, birthday cards, and school certificates until they landed on the stiff weight of paper. I pulled the file out, flipped it open, and there it was. Proof. Proof that the house my son so proudly showed off was mine. Proof that every dollar he spent inside those walls was spent under my roof, not his. A bitter smile crept across my lips. Marcus didn't even know he was living beneath the weight of my sacrifice. He thought he had erased me at his wedding. But these papers told another story. A story that could unravel everything he thought he owned. That night, as I laid the documents across the table, a seed of revenge took root in me. I no longer felt like the erased mother who walked out of a banquet hall unseen. I felt like the woman who held the keys to his downfall. And for the first time in a long while, I slept with a sense of control returning to my chest. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight. The stack of papers spread out before me like witnesses to a trial only I could hear. The title deed, the receipts, the documents that carried my name. They were reminders of every battle I had fought and won. Even when the world told me I would lose around me, the house was quiet, but my mind roared with decades of memories. Betrayal had never been a stranger to me. Robert had betrayed me when he walked out during my illness. Victoria had betrayed me by slipping into my place, smiling as though she had earned my sacrifices. And now my son Marcus, the child I had carried, fed and fought for, had delivered the sharpest betrayal of all. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest. For years I had mistaken silence for peace. I told myself I was keeping the family together by swallowing my pride, by letting things go, by pretending not to see the distance growing. But what had it earned me? A wedding where I was erased. My motherhood reduced to servitude. My sacrifices turned into punchlines. I rose and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The light was dim, but I could still see the scar across my throat, pale and jagged against my skin. For years I had hidden it beneath scarves, ashamed of what it signified. The illness that nearly took me. The weakness Robert couldn't bear. The reminder of a season when my body betrayed me. But staring at it now, I saw something different. That scar wasn't weakness. It was survival. It meant I had endured. It meant I had been left alone and still found a way to live. I traced it gently with my fingers and whispered to my reflection, "This is not my shame. This is my proof." In that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer the woman who would bow her head and accept humiliation. I was no longer the mother who would give endlessly while being erased. I was a survivor, marked but unbroken, scarred but stronger. I sat back down at the table, gathered the papers, and placed them neatly in front of me. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would not be silent anymore. The same strength that carried me through nights of scrubbing floors and days of healing from surgeries would now carry me through a different kind of battle. This one wasn't for survival. It was for dignity. I would remind Marcus and Robert that everything they stood on was built by me. And if they could not honor me as their foundation, then I would show them how easily that foundation could be pulled away. That night I made my decision. Silence had been my prison, but now it would be my weapon. The morning after I made my decision, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For too long I had been the giver, the silent one, the woman who bent so others could stand taller. But that version of me had walked out of the wedding hall and never returned. The woman who rose from bed that morning was someone else, someone ready to act. I started with the papers I had pulled from the drawer the night before. The title deed, the proof of ownership, the documentation that carried my name in bold print. This wasn't sentiment. It was power. With it, I went to the courthouse and began the process of reclaiming what was mine. Eviction papers were drawn, stamped, and placed in a crisp envelope. My hands didn't shake when I held them. They felt steady, almost eager. It wasn't long before Marcus and his new bride got the shock of their lives. They had barely returned from their honeymoon when I showed up at the house. The very house they called theirs, the one they flaunted on social media with wide smiles and captions about new beginnings. I stood at the doorway with the envelope in my hand. The weight of decades balanced on my shoulders. Marcus answered, looking surprised to see me. Sophia lingered behind him, still glowing in the aftertaste of wedding celebrations. "Mom," he said. His voice edged with caution, as though he hadn't quite decided how to treat me after what happened at the dinner. I handed him the envelope. "Open it," I said simply. He tore it open, his eyes skimming the words. Confusion clouded his face at first, then disbelief, then a sharp edge of panic. Sophia stepped forward, snatching the papers from his hands, reading them with widening eyes. "Eviction," she whispered, her voice tight. This is a mistake." But it wasn't. I laid the title deed on the entry table for them to see. My name in bold letters stared back at them. "This house is mine," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "It always has been. You've been living here under my roof on my grace. But that grace is gone. You have 30 days to leave." Marcus's face flushed, a mix of shock and anger. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "This is my home." I met his eyes without flinching. "No, Marcus. This is my home, and you will not erase me while living off the very foundation I built." Silence hung heavy in the room. Sophia looked between us, her expression faltering. The truth was undeniable, written in ink that could not be argued away. For the first time in his life, Marcus was seeing the woman behind his comfort, the backbone he had mistaken for weakness. I turned to leave, my heels steady against the hardwood floors. Behind me their voices rose. Confusion, anger, desperation, but none of it moved me. I had taken the first piece from them, and it would not be the last. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. My silence had ended. My revenge had begun. Taking back the house was only the first blow. It stripped away the illusion that Marcus stood on his own 2 feet, but I knew that without going further, he would still cling to other crutches I had quietly provided. Over the years, I had been the silent hand behind so much of his comfort. Co-signed accounts, hidden support, credit cards he never realized I controlled. Now it was time to sever those strings one by one until the safety net he thought was his birthright collapsed beneath him. The first step was the joint account I had kept open for emergencies. For years I deposited small amounts into it just in case Marcus ever fell behind on bills or needed help. He had grown so accustomed to money appearing when he overspent that he never questioned it. That account was closed with a single signature. No warning, no explanation. One day he swiped his card at a restaurant and it declined. That was my silence speaking. Next were the credit cards. I had co-signed for him when he was younger, wanting to build his credit, wanting him to start strong. But those cards had become more than tools. They were lifelines he leaned on when his own spending spiraled. With one phone call I canceled my ties to them. Overnight, his safety cushion was gone, and the debt he had piled up began knocking at his own door instead of mine. Then there were the bills I had been paying in secret. The car insurance covered quietly every month. The lingering student loan payment I had chipped away at behind the scenes so he could focus on his career without the stress of debt collectors. All of it stopped. For the first time in his life, Marcus was forced to face the reality of adulthood without me standing in the shadows absorbing the blows. But it wasn't just Marcus. Robert, too, had grown fat off my silence. There were still remnants of financial ties left from the marriage. Accounts and old agreements I had never pressed him on. Utilities he had leaned on me to cover when it benefited him. Pulled those threads as well. The man who once prided himself on being the image of stability began to feel the walls closing in. Bills arrived in his mailbox without warning. Balances called in full. Obligations resurfacing after years of being buried under my patience. The unraveling was steady and deliberate. I didn't announce it. Didn't storm in with accusations or ultimatums. I simply withdrew, one tie at a time, one quiet cut after another, until the very fabric of their false lives began to tear apart. I knew the effect it was having without even being in the room. The phone calls that came late at night unanswered. The messages filled with urgency that I deleted without opening. I could picture the arguments behind their doors, the confusion, the panic as they realized the ground beneath them wasn't theirs at all, had always been mine. And through it all, I remained silent, steady, unmoved. They thought they had erased me. But what they were learning was that my presence had been stitched into every corner of their comfort. By cutting those stitches, I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was forcing them to live without the mother, without the woman they had spent years dismissing. This was only the second blow, But already their foundation was trembling. Robert had always believed himself untouchable. When he left me during my illness, when he flaunted Victoria at Marcus's milestones, when he sat silently as I was humiliated at the wedding, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought the world would never hold him accountable. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the cracks forming beneath their feet. And I knew exactly where those cracks were buried because I had lived them, paid for them, and carried them on my back long after he walked away. The divorce had left behind loose ends Robert thought would remain forgotten. Financial threads tucked into accounts he once controlled. Obligations he never fully met. Debts he assumed I was too weary to chase. But I hadn't forgotten. And now I wasn't weary. I was ready. With a steady hand, I reopened old records, bank statements, court filings, agreements that Robert had sidestepped over the years. He had avoided certain payments during the divorce by convincing the court of his financial hardship that never truly existed. I knew the truth then, but I had let it go, more concerned with survival than justice. Now justice was my revenge. I submitted evidence to the right offices, let the numbers speak for themselves, and watched as the past came roaring back to his doorstep. The effect was immediate. Calls from creditors, unexpected legal notices, inquiries into accounts he thought buried. Robert's carefully maintained image of stability began to unravel. The polished exterior he presented at church, at dinners, at gatherings with Victoria by his side, was cracking, and Victoria, who had once seemed untouchable, began to shift in the shadows. She had been attracted to the confidence, the illusion of success, the man who looked like he had it all together. But as the facade crumbled, so did her devotion. I heard whispers, her tone sharper in public, her presence at his side less consistent, her laughter thinner. She had signed up to play the part of admired partner, not caretaker of a man losing his grip. And Marcus, he was reeling from his own unraveling, evicted from the home he thought was his. Cards declined, bills mounting. He looked to his father for strength, but what he found was a mirror image of his own collapse. Father and son, both stripped of the illusions they had built on my sacrifice, now stood exposed. The foundation they thought was theirs was gone, and the truth was unavoidable. Had always been mine. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to show my face. My silence had become their storm. Robert's reputation, once held up by falsehoods and polished lies, was now stained by the weight of his failures. And Victoria, the woman who once looked at me with subtle triumph, was quietly stepping back, distancing herself from a man who could no longer provide the shine she craved. Father and son thought they had erased me. But now together they were learning that everything they had stood on was borrowed, and the lender had come to collect. It was late evening when I heard the knock. First I didn't move. The weight of silence filled the house. The same silence I had lived in when Robert left. The same silence I carried home from Marcus's wedding dinner. But this time the silence didn't belong to despair. It belonged to strength. I opened the door and there he was. Marcus, my son, no longer the proud groom, no longer the polished attorney's child who believed appearances could replace truth. He looked broken. His clothes were wrinkled, his face drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The arrogance that once dripped from his voice was gone. He stood there as though he was searching for something he had lost long ago. The mother he had dismissed, erased, humiliated. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. I didn't move aside. I let him stand there in the doorway, the night air cool against us both. Finally he whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." And that was when I took him back, not into my home, but into his own past. I reminded him of nights when I worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. I reminded him of mornings when I went without food so he could eat. I reminded him of the tuition checks I signed with trembling hands, knowing it meant I couldn't repair the leaking roof or buy medicine I desperately needed. I painted the picture of sacrifice, a picture etched with love, with suffering, with a hope that he would grow into a man who would honor where he came from. Then I contrasted it with what he had given me. Shame. A wedding dinner where I was stripped of my title as mother, reduced to a servant in front of strangers, A lifetime of choosing others over me, siding with a man who abandoned us and a woman who had no stake in his upbringing. I let the silence hang heavy after my words. Marcus's tears fell, but I didn't reach to wipe them. That was his grief to carry. Forgiveness was not mine to give freely anymore. Forgiveness had been cheapened the moment he chose pride over blood. The true revenge, I realized in that moment, was not in punishing him further. It was in reclaiming myself. My dignity, my voice, my power. Whether I forgave him or not no longer defined me. What defined me was that I had survived, endured and risen. I told him plainly, "You chose who I was at that dinner, but tonight I choose who I am," and I left it at that. Whether he found a way back into my life or stood outside forever was no longer my burden to carry. The door remained where it always had been. But the power to open it, to step through it, belonged to me now. And for the first time in decades I felt free. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you forgive or would you let him live with the weight of his choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your answers might just spark the deepest part of this conversation. If you followed this journey to the end, don't just leave. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story of betrayal, resilience, and power reclaimed. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the beginning of the loudest revenge.